Someone stayed because your love didn't demand pain. Not the dramatic kind that makes stories sound meaningful, not the sharp edges that people mistake for passion, not the exhausting chaos that keeps hearts in a constant state of survival. Someone stayed because being with you felt like breathing without thinking about it. Because your love didn't ask them to bleed to prove it mattered. Because it didn't confuse intensity with depth or suffering with devotion. You didn't make love a test they had to pass. You didn't turn affection into a reward they had to earn after enduring silence, jealousy, or fear. You didn't believe that love had to hurt to be real. Instead, you made love feel like a place where they could rest without guilt. A place where they didn't have to explain why they were tired. A place where their softness wasn't something to be corrected or toughened. They had known love that came with conditions before. Love that arrived loud but left scars. Love that felt like standing in a storm and calling it romance because the thunder sounded powerful. They had learned to brace themselves, to stay alert, to measure every word in case it became ammunition later. They had learned that being loved often meant being anxious, and that calm was temporary, suspicious, something that never lasted. Then there was you. Not perfect. Not without flaws. But different in a way that felt unfamiliar and safe at the same time. You didn't raise your voice to feel heard. You didn't withdraw affection to gain control. You didn't keep score of mistakes or bring up the past to win the present. You spoke with honesty, not to wound, but to understand. You listened, not to reply, but to connect. Your love didn't say, "Prove yourself." It said, "Come as you are." And when they did, you didn't flinch. You didn't ask them to be smaller, tougher, quieter, or stronger than they were ready to be. You didn't rush their healing or turn their wounds into inconveniences. You treated their past with respect, not curiosity that wanted drama, but care that wanted clarity. Someone stayed because with you, love didn't feel like walking on glass. It felt like walking on solid ground. They could disagree with you without fearing abandonment. They could express hurt without being labeled difficult. They could have bad days without feeling like they were failing at being lovable. You allowed emotions to exist without turning them into battles. You understood that love is not built on adrenaline alone. That real connection grows in consistency, in small gestures repeated with sincerity. In checking in, not checking out. In choosing kindness even when ego wanted the last word. In staying present when it would have been easier to shut down. You didn't romanticize pain. You didn't call jealousy passion or control care. You didn't believe that love should feel like losing yourself. You believed that love should help you become more of who you are, not less. And because of that, being with you didn't feel like a sacrifice. It felt like alignment. Someone stayed because your love made room for peace. And peace, to someone who has known chaos, is not boring. It is revolutionary. It is healing. It is the first time their nervous system stopped bracing for impact. The first time their heart wasn't waiting for the other shoe to drop. You showed them that love can be gentle without being weak. That commitment doesn't have to be loud to be strong. That security is not the absence of passion, but the presence of trust. You laughed together without tension underneath it. You shared silence without wondering if something was wrong. You touched without needing to take something away. When conflict came, as it always does, you didn't use it as a weapon. You didn't disappear. You didn't punish. You stayed in the conversation even when it was uncomfortable. You chose repair over pride. You chose understanding over being right. And in doing so, you taught them something they had never fully believed before, that love can survive honesty. Someone stayed because your love didn't demand that they abandon themselves. They didn't have to ignore their intuition to keep you. They didn't have to shrink their needs to avoid arguments. They didn't have to perform happiness when they were hurting. You welcomed the whole of them, not just the easy parts. You made space for growth without turning it into criticism. You supported change without making it conditional. You celebrated progress without comparing it to anyone else's timeline. You understood that healing is not linear, and you didn't walk away when old patterns resurfaced. You stayed patient without becoming passive, caring without becoming controlling. Your love didn't feel like a transaction. It wasn't, "I give only if you give first." It was generosity without keeping receipts. It was showing up because you wanted to, not because you were afraid of losing them. And that intention was felt, deeply. Someone stayed because with you. Love didn't feel like a performance. They didn't have to constantly impress you to stay relevant. They didn't have to be entertaining, useful, or endlessly strong. They could be quiet. They could be uncertain. They could be human. You didn't confuse familiarity with neglect. Even in routine, you found ways to show care. Not always grand gestures, but consistent ones. Remembering small details. Checking in after hard days. Making eye contact when they spoke. Holding their hand when words weren't enough. You didn't treat love as something fragile that would break at the first sign of imperfection. You treated it as something resilient, something that could bend without shattering. And because of that, they felt safe to be real, not just agreeable. Someone stayed because your love didn't thrive on fear. It didn't need threats of leaving to stay powerful. It didn't rely on insecurity to feel intense. It was steady. And steady doesn't mean dull. It means dependable. It means warm. It means lasting. You taught them that love is not about who hurts more or who needs less. It's about who is willing to care better. Who is willing to learn. Who is willing to soften when everything inside wants to harden. With you, love felt like being chosen every day, not questioned every night. It felt like waking up without anxiety in the chest. Like speaking freely without rehearsing. Like knowing that disagreement wouldn't cost connection. Someone stayed because your love respected boundaries. You didn't see limits as rejection. You saw them as self-respect. You didn't push where they weren't ready. You didn't take offense to their need for space. You trusted that closeness doesn't disappear when autonomy exists. You allowed them to keep their individuality. Their friendships. Their dreams. Their pace. You didn't try to be their entire world. You wanted to be part of it, not the owner of it. And that made your bond stronger, not weaker. Your love didn't ask them to relive trauma to prove intimacy. You didn't force vulnerability before safety. You let trust build naturally. Brick by brick. And when they finally opened up, you held what they shared with care, not judgment or gossip or superiority. Someone stayed because your love felt emotionally mature. Not perfect, but responsible. Aware. Willing to reflect instead of react. Willing to apologize without excuses. Willing to change patterns instead of defending them. You didn't use love as leverage. You didn't say one thing and do another. Your words matched your actions often enough to build belief. You were consistent in ways that mattered. With you, love didn't feel like a gamble. It felt like an investment that made sense. Not because the future was guaranteed, but because the present was honest. Because what you offered was real, not an illusion maintained by chaos. Someone stayed because your love allowed joy without guilt. They didn't feel like happiness would be punished later. They didn't wait for the moment things would turn sour. They learned to enjoy good moments as they were, without bracing for loss. You didn't keep them guessing where they stood. You made your care clear. Not possessive, not overwhelming, just sincere. And sincerity is rare in a world that often confuses mystery with depth. Your love didn't drain them. It nourished them. They felt more like themselves with you, not less. They felt supported in becoming better, not pressured to become different. Someone stayed because your love didn't demand pain as proof. It didn't say, if it doesn't hurt, it doesn't matter. It said, if it hurts, let's understand why. And that difference changed everything. You showed them that love can be a safe place, not a battlefield. A partnership, not a power struggle. A journey, not a test. And maybe they stayed not because everything was easy, but because even when it was hard, it was kind. Even when it was messy, it was respectful. Even when it was uncertain, it was honest. Someone stayed because your love felt like home. Not the kind you escape from, but the kind you return to. The kind where you can take off your armor. The kind where you are allowed to rest. In a world that often glorifies suffering as depth, your love chose peace as strength. And that choice is why it lasted. Because love that doesn't demand pain gives people a reason to stay, not out of fear, but out of trust. Not because they are trapped, but because they are free, and that is the quiet power of the love you gave. Not loud. Not dramatic. Just real enough to heal, and gentle enough to keep. Someone stayed because over time, your love taught them how to unclench. Not all at once. Not dramatically. Slowly. In quiet moments that didn't announce themselves as healing. In mornings where their body woke up without dread. In evenings where their thoughts weren't racing to prepare for the next emotional emergency. Your presence didn't demand vigilance. It invited ease. They noticed it in the smallest ways. How they no longer rehearsed conversations before having them with you. How their shoulders dropped when you entered the room. How silence beside you didn't feel like a threat that needed filling. These changes weren't loud enough to brag about, but they were deep enough to matter. You didn't mistake their calm for disinterest. You didn't accuse peace of being laziness or lack of effort. You understood that love doesn't always roar. Sometimes it hums. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it simply shows up and stays. Someone stayed because your love respected their nervous system. You didn't overload them with emotional extremes just to feel important. You didn't pull them close only to push them away. You didn't create distance to see if they would chase you back. You allowed closeness to be mutual, not a game of imbalance. You were consistent enough that they didn't have to constantly decode you. Your mood wasn't a puzzle they had to solve to feel safe. Your affection wasn't unpredictable. And in that consistency, they found freedom. Freedom from overthinking. Freedom from self-blame. Freedom from the exhausting habit of trying to earn love every day. They stayed because with you, accountability didn't feel like punishment. When mistakes happened, you addressed them without cruelty. You named what hurt without turning it into an attack. You held your boundaries without shaming theirs. You understood that growth comes from clarity, not humiliation. Your love didn't require them to abandon their inner child to be taken seriously. You allowed playfulness without calling it immaturity. You allowed vulnerability without calling it weakness. You allowed emotions without labeling them as too much. Someone stayed because your love didn't make them feel replaceable. You didn't use comparison as motivation. You didn't hint at alternatives to create insecurity. You made it clear through actions, not just words, that they mattered as they were, not as a placeholder for someone else. You didn't weaponize independence or neediness. You understood that humans are allowed to want closeness and space at the same time. You didn't mock their needs or glorify emotional distance as strength. You chose balance, even when extremes would have been easier. They stayed because you didn't rush intimacy faster than trust could keep up. You let emotional closeness develop at a pace that felt safe. You didn't demand access to their deepest wounds before proving you could handle them. You earned trust through patience, not pressure. Your love didn't disappear when life became inconvenient. When stress entered the room, you didn't leave it to them to handle alone. You didn't minimize their struggles because you couldn't fix them. You stayed present even when solutions weren't immediate. Someone stayed because your love made room for imperfection without making it permanent. You believed people could be accountable and still worthy. You believed mistakes could be addressed without defining a person's character forever. You didn't treat love as something fragile that needed constant fear to survive. You treated it as something living, something that could grow through honesty and care. You trusted the bond enough to allow breathing space inside it. They stayed because your love didn't confuse emotional intensity with emotional intimacy. You didn't need constant conflict to feel connected. You didn't equate drama with depth. You found meaning in stability, not volatility. Your presence became a place they could return to themselves. A reminder that love can feel grounding instead of consuming. That connection doesn't have to cost your sense of self. Someone stayed because with you, they didn't feel like they were always one mistake away from being abandoned. They didn't feel like affection was conditional on perfection. They knew that being human wouldn't disqualify them from being loved. You showed them that love can be patient without being passive, firm without being harsh, honest without being cruel. And that combination created something rare, emotional safety. They stayed not because you held them tightly, but because you didn't have to. They stayed because staying felt like a choice they could make freely, every day, without fear, and in that freedom, your love became something they wanted to protect, not something they needed to escape from. Someone stayed because your love didn't demand pain to feel meaningful. It allowed joy to exist without punishment. It allowed calm to exist without suspicion. It allowed connection to exist without cost, and that kind of love doesn't beg. It doesn't chase. It doesn't threaten. It simply remains, steady enough to trust, gentle enough to keep. In the end, someone stayed because your love never asked them to choose between connection and self-respect. You didn't blur the line between love and endurance. You didn't glorify staying through suffering as loyalty. You showed them that commitment is not proven by how much pain one can tolerate, but by how much care two people are willing to give. They stayed because your love didn't turn every disagreement into a threat. You didn't make conflict a sign that the relationship was failing. You treated it as information, not destruction. As something to understand together, not something to survive alone. Over time, they realized something quietly powerful. With you, they were not in constant recovery mode. They weren't always repairing damage, apologizing for existing, or rebuilding trust that should never have been broken in the first place. Your love didn't create wounds just to offer comfort afterward. Someone stayed because your presence didn't drain them. It steadied them. Life was still life, unpredictable, heavy at times, but being with you didn't add unnecessary weight. You didn't become another thing they had to manage or emotionally tiptoe around. You became a place of balance inside the chaos. You didn't confuse love with possession. You didn't monitor, control, or suffocate. You trusted, and that trust was felt. It wasn't naive. It was intentional. It said, "I believe in you," without demanding proof every day. They stayed because your love allowed them to grow without fear of outgrowing you. You didn't compete with their evolution. You didn't feel threatened by their healing. You celebrated their expansion, even when it meant change. With you, love didn't feel like a cycle of highs and crashes. It felt like a rhythm. Sometimes quiet. Sometimes joyful. Sometimes challenging. But always grounded. Always humane. Someone stayed because your love didn't make them question their worth in moments of frustration. You didn't use disappointment as a reason to withdraw care. You didn't make affection scarce to increase its value. You gave love freely, knowing that generosity strengthens connection rather than weakening it. You allowed forgiveness to exist without erasing accountability. You allowed accountability without erasing compassion. And in that balance, they learned that love doesn't have to choose between being kind and being honest. They stayed because your love didn't feel like something they had to earn repeatedly. It felt like something that existed, steady and reliable, even on days when they felt unsure of themselves. In your love, they found permission to rest. Not just physically, but emotionally. To stop bracing. To stop expecting disappointment. To stop preparing exit plans in their mind just in case things fell apart. Someone stayed because your love didn't punish vulnerability. It didn't collect confessions to use later. It didn't turn openness into exposure. What was shared with you stayed safe with you. You didn't chase intensity at the expense of trust. You didn't chase excitement at the expense of respect. You understood that lasting love is not built by burning fast, but by staying warm. They stayed because your love was not perfect, but it was sincere. And sincerity builds something that performance never can, in a world that often teaches people to equate love with struggle. Your love offered an alternative truth, that care can be calm, that devotion can be gentle, that commitment can feel like support instead of sacrifice. Someone stayed because with you, love didn't feel like something they had to survive. It felt like something they could live inside, and that is why they stayed. Not because they were afraid to leave. Not because they didn't know any better. But because your love made staying feel safe, dignified, and real. Love that doesn't demand pain doesn't trap people. It frees them. And when people are free, and still choose you, that choice carries a quiet, undeniable power. That is the kind of love you gave. And that is why it lasted.